Today we're going to be talking about games. We're going to talk about games and how they really make training a lot more meaningful, certainly motivational, and memorable. And I really believe that, and we're going to go through a whole bunch of different types of game mechanics. We're going to go through a bunch of stuff. I'm curious here, before we even get started, who here, by just show of hands, who here is using games right now in their training? So about 50% of the room. Okay, so we'll talk about certainly a lot of use cases. Obviously, there are lots of opportunities to use games, and we'll talk about how people are using them. Just to introduce myself, my name is Baer. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called The Game Agency. I run creative for the company. I also write a monthly article for Forbes focused on game-based training. And before I started this company about 12 years ago, I was director of marketing at Atari. So I've been in this industry for a while. I think it's an amazing medium. And we'll talk about certainly all the use cases in certainly this function for this use case. So today, what are we going to discuss? We're going to talk about why training games are effective. And there's lots and lots of reasons. We're going to talk about how to map them properly to different learning and performance objectives. We're talking about how to build games and how to use the data that's within the games to certainly improve the performance of our employees. And last but not least, we're going to talk about when to use training games. So when is it appropriate for M-learning or e-learning? When is it appropriate for instructional-led training? What mechanics are best used across the board? So just to start with why games, because that's a question I think all of us get sometimes. Well, why would I use a game instead of anything else I'm doing? And I think that none of this stuff is surprising, right? People just by nature today are distracted easily. Games are a lot more immersive, and they can get you engaged on a much deeper level with your content. Beyond that, I think that we can often hear that just our employees are just not stimulated by the training that we're doing. So how do we get them off their chairs and actually engage with the content and digging in on a deeper level? And then the last thing is that, especially with the millennial generation, there's a huge craving for feedback, right? And the reality is that traditional training is much more passive in nature, and as a result, you're going to maybe be deploying information, but you're not going to be giving them feedback on how they're performing or engaging with that information. So games, they're engaging. They certainly increase the level of attention. They keep people much more focused, and they drive improvement in performance. And we're going to go through that in detail. So I'm curious, and I asked you guys to shout out, what type of games do people here like? And that could be any type of games. It could be your traditional video games, your mobile games, your board games, your card games. Can people just shout out? I'm curious what people here like. Cards Against Humanity, did I hear that? Jeopardy, all right. So these are examples of things, and I heard some of these. These are examples of some of the games that I heard, right? And it's really interesting if you think about what, and by the way, if anybody wants any copies of these, this deck, I'm happy to send it to you, so please let me know. But as we think about the different types of game mechanics that people are playing for pleasure, and certainly that could be any types of games. That could be, as we mentioned, traditional video games, card games, board games. A lot of them can be really effectively converted to training tools, and we're going to talk about that. But I think that one of the things that I encourage my clients and certainly partners to do is to think about how do you play off of what people like personally and apply it to your education to hopefully engage them on a deeper level. What do all these games have in common? So they all have rules, they all have strategies, and they all have goals. So kind of just to bring that to life, in the analogy of baseball, rules, 3 strikes and you're out, 3 outs and the inning's over, 9 innings and the game's done. Strategies, well, what types of things might you want to do? You might want to do a curveball, or you might want to bunch, or you might want to steal bases. So thinking about different ways you want to play a game to get ahead. And ultimately, what is your goal? The end of the goal is, in the game of baseball, is to get the most runs to ultimately beat the other team. All these games have those 3 components, and that's something that is really important within using game-based training, is to make sure that you're providing those 3 things: a rule set, a level of strategies for your employees to know how to actually succeed within your game, and ultimately a goal to make them feel like they have completed something successfully. I really believe that brains and games are a really perfect marriage. They accomplish, in my mind, 3 things. They provide employees with a safe place to practice, to learn, and to fail. right? No one wants to fail in real life, but if you give them a virtual environment to do so, it is an incredibly useful tool because they're willing to try over and over and over again. Also reinforces the knowledge, and certainly as people are trying over and over again, it's digging into their brains on a much deeper level. And it's driving much greater retention as a result. So let's play a game. We're going to talk about digital games for the most part today, but just because it's 8 a.m. and I want to get you guys awake, we're going to play a game called Boom Shakalaka. Has anyone here ever played Boom Shakalaka? Probably not, because I made it up. Okay. So here's the rules. Everyone here needs to find a partner, and if you're at a table where there's not a 2-person, let's get a 3-person. Everyone here needs to take out a virtual deck of cards, okay? Make sure that you mix up your deck so that you're not cheating, okay? That was a joke. And what I want you to do is I want you to count to 3, the pair, and I want you to, at the same time, we're going to just use the theme of animals. At the same time, I want you to say an animal. So if it's you and me, and we'd say 1, 2, 3, I would say dog, and you'd say cat. Well, we didn't get the same thing. We're going to keep going, 1, 2, 3, until we get to the same thing. As soon as you get to the same thing, I want you to stand up, and as loud as you can, yell, Boom Shakalaka! Come on. All right, let's take a quick break and let's start that game, okay? 1, 2, 3, everybody. All right. Nice. Nice. Okay. All right, so we've got a lot of Boom Shakalakas here, but what are we doing here, right? We're working on listening skills. We're working on recall skills. We're thinking about what each other are saying, and we're actually working together to memorize what they're saying and applying that from a strategic standpoint to think about what we might want to say next, right? So I think you guys were the first Boom Shakalakas? All right, so some Jeopardy t-shirts for you guys.
We got a Boom Shakalaka t-shirt.
All right, and I think, and we may have, can I ask for your help, Jamie?
Is that an extra medium?
Well, yes. So we're going to do first 3 teams. I think that was 1, 2, and I think 3 in the way back. And then we may have to do some mixes for them to come to our booth. All right. So how do you choose the game that meets your learning objective, right? And that's a really important thing. There are lots of fun games out there, but if it doesn't really apply well to what you're trying to teach, your training objective, your learning objective, your performance objective, it's probably not useful. So I always start with this chart. It's an eye chart, and I apologize. And once again, if you want to copy the slide, please let me know. But I think about what types of things are we trying to do. We're trying to drive memorization. Are we trying to improve judgment? We're trying to improve the ability to think through consequences, strategy, simulations. And then when you take the next step, applying the right skill sets against those performance objectives, right? And once you've tried to figure out, okay, well, let's say I really want to improve my strategy. I want people to be able to appraise things or categorize things. I want people to classify things. Start to think about what games might apply. There are dozens and dozens of game mechanics out there, and we have some really nice cheat sheets as to what ones apply to what objectives. But I think it's important to start here because, you know, I have folks that hear sometimes say, "Gosh, I really just want to create a Pac-Man game, or I want to create a jumping game, or I want to, or just a trivia game." That's great, but making sure that it applies to the right objective, I think, is important. So here are a few examples. These are all simple games. Jeopardy is a game that I think probably if you've used games, I'd say probably of the people who here have used games, probably 50% of people have used it. It's a good tool. It's a good tool, but quite honestly, it's a good testing tool. It's a good reinforcement tool. I don't think it's a great teaching tool, right? So I think it's a good tool to use, but I think you have to make sure that it applies to what you want to accomplish. Trivia, same thing. Scramble is a really interesting thing. You look at Scramble and thinking about having people take concepts and spell it out and think it through. That's a little more strategic in nature. Scenarios, thinking about games that are making someone go down a different path, try out certain things, simulate conversations, soft skill types of engagements. And that's great for customer service training, for sales training, for management training, negotiation training. These are all different games mechanics, and once again, I have cheat sheets that I'm happy to share with you. And then you can get a little more gamey. You can think about how do I want to create something that may be more of a jumper or more of a match 3 game, but making sure that you're applying it to, one, you're weaving it into your training in an effective way. It doesn't just sit in a silo, but two, that it's accomplishing your goal and it's mapping well to the content you're trying to, or the strategy you're trying to improve. We recently did a study of 1,000 games, and we saw something that's really interesting. This, by the way, is a study across 1,000 games we have in a product called the Training Arcade. I think that this data is actually, quite honestly, applicable to most games out there. So most training games, as long as they're good training games. So we saw that the average person's playing these micro training games for about 6 minutes, which is good. It's a small reinforcement of our training. But we also seeing that employees are coming back to play these games almost 3 times. So I don't know how many, by a show of hands, how many people are coming back to us on a daily basis saying, gosh, I want to do that training again. And it's not that often, right? So trying to think about what types of tools we can use to actually get someone more engaged with the content and someone who's on their own going to say, I really want to dive in further. And normally it's because of a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, right? But ultimately, the byproduct is that they are engaging with your training content on a much deeper level. So we're seeing them coming in total about 18 minutes. Probably the most important stat, though, is we're seeing a real lift in knowledge. We're seeing a 64% increase in knowledge from the first to the third time someone has served a question. So they really, it's driving into their brain, which is fantastic. One of the things that I often talk about is games are great because they're fun, because they're engaging, because they're valuable. But if you're not measuring beyond that, I think it's a real lost opportunity. So one of the things I think that we need to think about is what can we look at from the raw numbers, how many people are coming, what are their scores, their rankings, how many sessions are they playing, what are they getting correct, incorrect. And that's all raw data, and I think that's great. But then I think we can go a step further and think about behavioral trends. What do we know about the person who's playing? What do we see about their personality? What do we see about where their skills lie? So there's some games, Scenarios is a great example, the branching paths where you can really understand who that person is, right? And understand, are they, one, what is their personality? 2, where do they belong from a function standpoint with my organization? Some of the things that we focus on a lot is really analyzing the individual and trying to figure out not just what they know, but who they are and how they best perform within my organization. What function is going to be most appropriate for them? And I think that's a real opportunity for a lot of us in this room to try to think about not just how do I deploy information, but how do I make sure that the people I'm deploying information to are properly allocated into the right role within the company. I often say that data is really king. I use this as a great example. Most people here are probably either played or are familiar with the game Candy Crush. The game itself drives $590,000 a day in revenue. And the reason it's driving that is because they are analyzing the data of their players on a daily basis. And they're tweaking things. And I'm not suggesting that all of us should become game designers and tweaking games on a daily basis, but the reality is that if we look at the data and we understand how people are performing, what people know, and occasionally we're changing our training accordingly, and we're changing our reinforcement tools in the form of games accordingly, I think that we can improve performance on a much higher level. Not only do I think it, I've seen it. So I encourage you to think about that, because I think it's a really important topic. So where and how often should we be using games? I think there are really 3 areas that you can use games in the learning journey. I think certainly preparing people early on with the content, and I think it's a great tool for teaching. Once again, there are some mechanics that are much more applicable than others. On-the-job application, helping them ongoing simulate what they're doing in a virtual world, really critical. And then improving skills. As you're seeing deficiencies or gaps, there's opportunities to apply reinforcement. I think it's an ongoing loop. And games don't need to be big. They can be small experiences. We look at the types of games that are out there, really kind of break them into 3 categories. We see micro games, so a lot of those little ones that I was showing you, those could be 5, 10-minute experiences. You get a much more deep e-learning games, much bigger simulations, and I'll show you some examples. And then you can certainly use games from an ILT standpoint and make it part of your instructor-led initiatives. The reality is that nobody wants to be just spoken to, right? I think that the reality is probably it was more fun when you guys were playing with each other than listening to me, right? So that's the whole point, is getting people to actually engage with the content, with each other, as opposed to just passively listening. So we talked about small games like this. Then you think about bigger games. Think about bigger simulations. And what's really fantastic about simulations is you can tell a story. You can get someone to try something. You can certainly build characters and have someone go through something in a virtual experience and try it out, learn from it, fail safely, and try again until they've succeeded. You also get a tremendous more data on that individual. Going back to the behavioral trends, this is where you can get a lot more of that. And you can apply this really to any type of training. It can be onboarding, it can be process training, product training, compliance training, really runs the gamut. But we've seen that in an immersive experience like these, you can take e-learning from a very passive to an incredibly interactive experience. The third place that certainly was talking about where to use training is in an instructor-led training environment. I believe, and it's not just games, I believe that a really well-crafted instructor-led training environment combines a bunch of things. It's going to combine slideware with videos, with games, with activities, with polls. It's going to make it a much more interactive experience, a well-rounded media experience. And I think the more you can get people to, at tabletops of 10 like we are today, or at kiosks around the room, or on their individual devices, engage with content, practice content, put in leaderboards, have some prizing, try to incentivize people, you're going to make it a much more memorable and, quite honestly, effective training experience overall. So, a few takeaways. I have 6 takeaways, and I have 6 tips. So that's 12 altogether. It's going to be really long. Okay, so the first takeaway. I really believe that focusing on fun first is important. Just by nature of my background, I approach everything that we do as a game-first concept. I want to make sure that it applies well to the education, but I really believe what I say here is no chocolate-covered broccoli. I often hear people say, oh, we're doing quizzes, and so that's kind of a game, and I don't know that anyone here would say, I took this 10-question multiple-choice quiz, it was really fun. And I think the point is making sure that if you're going to build a game, build a game. Build something that's going to engage someone that they're going to want to come back and do again, right? Second thing is thinking about alignment, making sure that you're taking the right game mechanic for the right learning objective. Just using a game for game's sake is often not useful. So that's something I think is critical. Third thing is really diving into the data, understanding how people are learning, what behavioral trends we're seeing, and making sure that you're applying that to your future training and certainly your analysis on the people who are taking that training. As you're building games, you always want to make it easy to enter and certainly more challenging as people go, right? So anyone who plays simple mobile games would see that there's a level system, right? So you might want to make it just increasingly difficult over time. That will keep people engaged. That will actually keep people incentivized to try to beat the next level. Right? Feedback. Making sure that you're constantly providing feedback to people. Not just on whether they're doing a good job or whether they're not, but also reinforcing the key information that you're trying to get them to understand. There's lots of opportunities, benchmarks within the game to do that. And the last one is creating a connection with people, making them feel like they are progressing over time, using points, using badges, using leaderboards, using different visuals to show that they are progressing and achieving throughout the game. So how do you get started? I always use this as kind of 6 questions to ask to get started. Who's my target audience, right? At the end of the day, most of us are training a diverse group of people by gender, by age, by geo, by function, but really thinking about who my audience is and what types of games might appeal to them, right? And there's not one game that appeals to everybody, but it's try to find the best option based on who you have. What performance objectives are you trying to improve? And this goes back to that eye chart that I showed you earlier. What skills need to be improved to improve that performance? There are lots of little things you can do to improve those or to reinforce those skill sets. Where are you going to roll this out? I think that there are some games that are great for a group setting. There are some games that are great for an individual experience. So making sure that you pick the right game or games to appeal to that environment. How can your games most effectively enhance the training you're doing today? I don't think that games should replace. I think that games are a really nice enhancement of what you're doing. So there's slideware, there's videos, there's other forms of passive training. How can you use games to weave throughout to actually engage people? And last, how do you incentivize players? And this goes back to the points, the badges, the leaderboards. The prizes. What's appropriate for your organization, and how do you most effectively incentivize them to stay with it? These are all questions that I think are critical for asking early on, because without having the answer to these things, you're not going to have the right games. So that in 20 minutes or less is my slideware. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also invite you over to booth 319, just happy to show you a bunch of stuff as well. But if there's questions, by all means, please go ahead. Yes, sir. Is
there any copyright issue, like using Jeopardy?
It's a great question. So my company approached Sony about a year ago saying, hey, everyone's using Jeopardy in the industry. How do we get a license? And they said no one has a license. So we have the license now. But so we have a game that we sell for Jeopardy. But the reality is that technically companies should not be using that without their approval. Yeah. That said, and I don't mean to do myself a disservice and say, gosh, I shouldn't get sales on this. You can use mechanics without using the IP, right? So, I encourage people to buy from me. At the same time, like, not everyone has budgets for that, and if they don't have budgets for that, then I suggest thinking about what are best practices out there, and how do you apply that without using a particular intellectual property. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, combination of, so those are all built in-house, combination of Unity or HTML, Java, but not using like rapid authoring tools or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of any open source stuff that would be out there to where you could quickly fashion a simple game for instruction?
Well, so not open source in that it's free. We do, one of the products I was showing you, the Training Arcade, is a tool that anyone in this room can create a game in 15 to 30 minutes. So what we tried to do is build a tool that took what was 90 hours in some of the rapid authoring tools down to a much quicker time frame, and also at a price point that's pretty manageable for anybody. So happy to show that to you. So yes. In an LMS, great question. So in the example of, it depends on what you're building. So if you're building a custom, you want to make sure that it's wrapped with a SCORM wrapper and that it will obviously deliver the basic data to your LMS. But that won't deliver the leaderboard. It will deliver Stephen Baer passed, he completed, he took it. Most LMSs are not equipped to showcase that leaderboard. So yeah, you need to. It basically needs to sit on its own in that regard. Yeah. Does that address your question, or? Well, there's two things. So I guess there's what someone views when they're actually playing the game, right? So for instance, right. So that's within the game setting. But if you're saying, gosh, I want person X to see within my LMS a leaderboard, there are LMSs that have that functionality, but I'd say that 95% of LMSs don't. So it's about having an LMS that's going to accommodate that. Yes, sir.
Outside of putting chocolate on broccoli and doing games for game's sake, what are some of the most common mistakes people make with games?
So yeah, it's a good question. I would say that part of it is picking just a game because it's something that you enjoyed playing as just as an individual, right? As opposed to making sure that it aligns properly with your training material. I would say that also sometimes there's a misalignment with budget and timing. If you're going to build a big simulation, it's going to take a hefty budget, and it's certainly going to take months to do.
Define hefty.
Well, the simulations I showed you up there are going to run anywhere from low 6 figures to low 7 figures. So that's it. Some organization that's easy, but there's some organizations that say, "Gosh, I can't get away with $5,000 as a budget," right? So it's trying to identify the right tools or the right products, right experiences based on your budget and time frame. Yeah. Yes?
Is the game integrated like Captivate itself, or is it a separate lesson?
So, well, it depends on the tools that you're using. So, for instance, with the Training Arcade, all those games can be embedded into Captivate or Storyline or Lectora as web objects. So they flow perfectly through. That said, if you look at the bigger simulation games, you can, in theory, do that. It depends. You could do that with some of the web-based ones. Certainly, some of the bigger Unity builds, it's hard to do that with. So, you guys, it's case by case. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Stephen, our organization implemented a micro-learning platform this October, actually. And what we noticed, or what we've seen, is our employees, our organization is about 330, 350 people. And we saw a lot of engagement when we first launched and rolled it out in upwards of around 200 to 250 staff members. Some staff members just never logged in. And now we're seeing kind of it plateau at around 100 to 120 active users on a weekly basis. Can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It actually ties back to what you were asking about. Where are opportunities for failure, or I don't mean to call it a failure, but for improvement, right? And so I think that one of the things that you need to think about as you're building games is having a sustained message and certainly campaign, right? And also having content that is going to last, right? So I actually would love to talk offline about what you're using, right? But one of the things we find is that a lot of the organizations that have really embraced games, it's important to have micro content or micro games that are going to be woven in on a weekly basis, little competitions, little prizing, ongoing messaging that's going to reinforce that content. But it's going to be a 5, 10, 15-minute investment on your employees' part on a weekly basis, and it's going to have not just experiences, but here's obviously your leaderboard functionality, but here's your prizing, here's your either tangible or experiential rewards, and having that right mix. So I'd love to talk about what you guys are doing just for my own sake, but I think it's really having a sustainable campaign that's going to make sure that it's successful. Otherwise, if you just put it out there, much like the Field of Dreams, or unlike the Field of Dreams, I don't know that everyone will come and stay, right? So yeah, I hear that a lot, and I think that you have to have that long-term strategy. Any other questions? Yes?
From your experience, what's been like the best use case that you've seen?
That's a great great question. We see a lot of companies use it for Salesforce meetings. You know, it's funny. We work with a lot of companies, certainly in product launch meetings, thinking about bringing somebody into an environment like this for 2 or 3 days straight. It can get really boring really fast, right? So how do you engage people? How do you have people throughout the day working with each other and actually making it a much more engaging experience as opposed to a passive learning experience? I also see that, you know, folks, if they're going to be doing a session like that, are successful in building a pre and post-launch rollout, right? How do you reinforce that? How do you, 2 months in advance, every 2 weeks, deliver micro content, just like that gentleman's talking about there, right? How do you make sure that you're building not just delivering the content, but have a campaign that's talking about weekly incentives to actually participate? So I think that those types of triggers are really effective. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys have, and thank you again for coming so early. Appreciate it.